Bible this evening to Leviticus chapter 14. Leviticus chapter 14 as we continue our study of the law that God delivered to Moses to govern his chosen nation. Last lesson we covered the first part of this chapter that dealt with the laws of cleansing those who had been healed from leprosy and the different ceremonies that were involved in that. This cleansing involved the examination of the person, a thorough washing, depending on the details involved. And then also sacrifices that were to be given, 3 lambs for those who could afford it, a lamb and 2 birds for those who couldn't. But all those kind of pictured the atonement for sin, which sin is represented by leprosy so often in the scriptures, and this is no exception. Tonight we cover the rest of the chapter, which is a new aspect of leprosy and how to deal with it, this time in the context of houses. Now, I've been told by my family that the last few lessons have been a little bit lengthy, and so you'll get a bit of a reprieve tonight because this one's fairly short. At least my notes are short. We'll see how that goes, but it should be a little shorter than what they have been recently because the chapter just kind of ends up at a spot, and I didn't want to jump into chapter 15 this week, and so we'll save that for next week and maybe the next. But this one should be a little bit shorter, so we'll go ahead and get to it. Leviticus chapter 14, verses 33 and 34 is where we'll start. Verse 33 says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, When ye come into the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put the plague of leprosy in a house of the land of your possession, and he that owneth the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, It seemeth to me there is as it were a plague in the house." I'll start working real good this evening. So there are a couple of interesting points here in the beginning of this section. One is that the law comes into effect once the children of Israel reach the promised land or reach and settle in Canaan. It is very specific about that, so this isn't something that really applied at this point. And that does make sense. Remember, at this point, they're living in tents, right? There's no permanent dwellings, and so what this is addressing is leprosy that may appear within a permanent dwelling in someone's house. At this point, they're dwelling in tents, and so most likely the laws regarding the fabrics and skins and things like that we covered a couple of weeks ago would deal with any kind of situations that might arise in the camp itself. But this particular situation is one that was limited to Canaan, limited to their arrival there in the Promised Land. Of course, knowing the story, we know that it would be about 40 years before that took place because they were going to spend a lot of time wandering in that wilderness because they refused to enter into the Promised Land the first time that they got there. The other item that's unique in this case is that the leprosy is described very specifically as a direct act of God. Now, we know that in some other cases, leprosy was used by God as a sign of judgment upon different people. We know Miriam is one who experienced that in particular, but there are other instances where that took place, where the leprosy was a direct judgment from God. We also know that leprosy was also a natural disease and something that could be contracted, and like we've talked about several times, it also probably included other diseases besides specifically leprosy under that broad heading. And so that being the case, it could be a natural thing that caused you to get leprosy. It could be a judgment from God. But this one is very specific. It says that I will send this plague upon you. And so the Jews had the opinion, or what were of the idea, that this was something that was specifically the people of God, and specifically those in Palestine were the ones who fell under this particular situation, or potentially would fall under this situation, and that those who were Gentiles, those who were without the nation, those who were not in that region would not fall under these requirements and would not have this happen to them because they viewed it very much as a direct act of God or direct act of judgment. That also seems to fall in line with the fact that there's really no parallel that we have to these kind of symptoms or these things that are arising in these houses. There's been ideas and speculations and thoughts about different potential things that it could be, but there's nothing that is real close to what we have described here as leprosy within a household. And so it does seem that this was a situation where this particular type of leprosy, this particular scenario, was an act of God, an act of judgment for whatever reason. And again, there's a lot of different speculations about, well, what would be the cause of this? And because the Bible doesn't say specifically, we don't know. It is just speculation. But it does seem to be judgment from God. It does seem to be limited to His people there in the Promised Land when they arrived there. So it's something that they did need to be aware of, though. And in the case, or as was in the case of the other forms of leprosy, the priests were responsible for the confirmation of that. Verse 35 talked about that the person who suspects that it may be there were to go to the priest and explain that. Verse 36 goes on and says, then the priest shall command that they empty the house before the priests go in to see the plague, that all that is in the house be not made unclean, and afterward the priest shall go in to see the house. And so when the signs appeared, the owner of the house called the priest to come and to determine what was going on, if it was leprosy or not. Before the priest would enter the premises, everything had to be taken out. And that's not just the people, that was everything. Furniture, whatever other items were in the house, the whole house had to be cleared out before the priest would go in and examine it. Now, that probably indicates that whatever this leprosy was, that it wasn't necessarily extremely contagious. Now, we've already talked a little bit about how leprosy isn't really contagious or extremely contagious. It is contagious, but not overly contagious. But this seems to be even less so because it says to clear things out. It's not that you isolate the things. It's not that the people that come out of the house have to be separated from others or anything like that. It's just that they weren't to stay in the house. And so the idea seems to be that it wasn't necessarily dangerous for the short-term exposure, but under longer-term exposure, it could be something that would be hazardous to you, something that could be cause illness or may even develop into leprosy within an individual. Again, if this is judgment of God, certainly it'd be hard to place any natural restrictions on it. And so the expectation there is that they clear out the house, and as the priest goes in, he has a clear view of whatever it is that's going on there. And so he would go in, he would examine things, take a look and see what was happening. Verses 37 through 42 talk about that. It says, and he shall look on the plague, and behold, if the plague be in the walls of the house, with hollow streaks, greenish or reddish, which inside are lower than the wall, then the priest shall go out of the house to the door of the house, and shall shut up the house 7 days. And the priest shall come again the 7th day, and shall look, and behold, if the plague be spread in the walls of the house, then the priest shall command that they take away the stones in which the plague is, and they shall cast them into an unclean place without the city. And he shall cause the house to be scraped within round about, and they shall pour out the dust that they scrape off without the city into an unclean place. And they shall take the other stones and put them in the place of those stones, and shall take other mortar and shall plaster the house. So here's kind of the explanation of not only what to look for, but what to do about it. The description of leprosy here is very similar to what's been mentioned in the previous cases. If you remember, on the individual, the leprosy was to be looked at, and if it was deeper than the skin, that was one of the key things. It was that it was beneath the surface of the skin, that it wasn't just a scab or something along those lines, but there was something underneath that was going on, and that's the idea that it talks about when it talks about the hollow streaks, the corrosive area within the wall or something along those lines. It said to look for those things, and so that would kind of compare to the leprosy in a person. The other speaks of the discoloration, which we saw dealing with the skins and fabrics and things like that, if it's greenish or reddish, or the idea there being, again, an abnormal green or red color, something that it wouldn't naturally be. It was to be examined. If it was found to be leprosy or potentially leprous, then the priest would leave the premises, shut the door, lock it up basically, and nobody was permitted in there for 7 days. That follows, again, the typical pattern for determining leprosy. If you have a suspected spot, you give it a week, and if it's spread, then that gives you the answer that you're looking for. And so that's what they were to look for. That's what's going on here, is they spend the week allowing that to spread or to not spread, and to make their determination afterward. It is important that, again, things be cleared out so that the priest can see it well, and that he's able to determine with certainty whether it's spreading or not. As was the case for the other types of leprosy, the spread of the potential leprosy was determined at that point, and then the response was depending on what had happened. Verse 43 says, "And if the plague come again and break out in the house, after that he had taken away the stones." Oh, hang on a second. Let me go back. You tear out the bad parts if it's bad. Okay, the stones that were there, the plaster, you clear it all out, get away anything that was potentially connected to it, and you replace it. And so it's kind of a remodeling project, right? It's like what happened to my floors. Brother Kevin crawled under there and found out there's a lot more than we thought there was, and so we had to do a lot of replacing. And so that's kind of what they did. They go in, they tear out what's bad, they replace the stones, they recover it with the plaster, and then they wait longer. And it says that if it comes back, so that's where we pick up in verse 43. And if the plague come again and break out in the house, after that he hath taken away the stones, and after that he has scraped the house, and after it is plastered, then shall the priest come and look, and behold, if the plague be spread in the house, it is a spreading leprosy in the house, it is unclean. And he shall break down the house, and the stones of it, and the timber thereof, and all the mortar of the house, and he shall carry them forth out of the city into an unclean place. And so, if after the repair takes place, if the plague persists, more drastic measures were clearly called for, and the entire house has to be demolished. It is taken down all the way to the foundation. Every part of it is to be taken outside of the city, deposited in the unclean place, for the purpose of not allowing it to be used anywhere else. In that kind of situation and time, if there was a house that was demolished, everybody was looking for, material to repair their house or to build something new. But certainly if it's got leprosy in it, you don't want to use those materials. And so it was to be taken without the camp. In this instance, of course, later, really, it didn't apply in the camp, in the cities. Whatever city the house was in, or village or town, there would be designated areas outside of that place where unclean things would be taken. This would join the pile and be deposited there, so that nobody would use it. Verses 46 and 47 address anyone who enters into the house while it's supposed to be closed up for this process. Verse 46, "Moreover, he that goeth into the house all the while that it is shut up shall be unclean until the even, and he that lieth in the house shall wash his clothes, and he that eateth in the house shall wash his clothes." So there's kind of two different levels, I suppose, of uncleanness that are talked about here. One is anybody who goes into the premises, anybody who enters the place. One writer said that the Jews had the opinion, even if you just stuck your head in the door, right? And you didn't put your foot in, but I just kind of poked you, then you're unclean. And so if that was the case, you were unclean until even. And remember, to be unclean just meant that you were ceremonially unclean, that you weren't permitted into the tabernacle area. You weren't supposed to interact with other people and things like that. You were supposed to separate yourself as being unclean so that you don't spread that uncleanness or you don't defile anything else. And that goes through the even. Now, that's basically a day. For one day, you weren't to have any kind of contact with people or anything like that. The other instance was those who slept in the house or ate in the house, and that kind of pictures somebody who has a more extended stay. They didn't just poke their head in to see what was going on, but that they were in there for an extended period for whatever reason. Then they were to wash themselves or wash their clothes and be unclean again, and that would pass in the evening. And so, again, this probably doesn't have much to do with a highly infectious situation that's going on here and trying to limit that infection, because you would expect it might need a little bit more lengthy time away than that. But this really had more to do with the ceremonial aspect of it and the uncleanness of the leprosy as much as it did any potential danger that it may have had. And so that was the requirement for those who were in the house. And again, you might think, well, why would anybody go in there? But if this is your house, if it's the only place that you have to stay, then you can see why people might end up going back in there even though they weren't supposed to, because where else are you going to stay? A rainstorm blows up, and what are you going to do? And so that probably wasn't that unusual, but like I said, it just makes you unclean until the evening, or you have to wash your clothes and things like that to provide for the cleansing there. Verses 48 through 53 deal with the offering that's to be presented in the cases where the leprosy is successfully removed. So if the priest goes in, they tear out the part that's bad, and and repair it, and now nothing shows up again, everything seems good, then there is a sacrifice that is required. And again, it falls in line with the sacrifice for the cleansed leper. This will be a cleansed house. It's the same sacrifice or ceremony involved as it was for the clean leper who was outside of the city. Verses 48 through 53. And if the priest shall come in and look upon it, and behold, the plague hath not spread in the house, after that the house was plastered, then the priest shall pronounce the house clean, because the plague is healed. And he shall take to cleanse the house 2 birds and cedar wood, and scarlet and hyssop. And he shall kill the one of the birds in an earthen vessel over running water. And he shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet and the living bird, and dip them in the blood of the slain bird and in the running water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. And he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, and with the running water, and with the living bird, and with the cedar wood, and with the hyssop, and with the scarlet. But he shall let go the living bird out of the city into the open fields, and make an atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. So again, this corresponds with the ceremony for the cleansed individual that took place outside of the city. Now, there aren't any further offerings after that. This was the end of the requirement for a household that had been cleansed. And again, that probably ties into the idea that it wasn't an individual, and so you don't have that idea of atonement in the same sense. You have the idea of the ceremonial cleansing that's taking place here, and the return to the freedom to use that house, the freedom to be able to dwell in it once again, and because it's not destroyed, it is now cleansed, it is now healed from the plague that was in it. So, same basic representations, though, that we saw in this ceremony that was involving the 2 birds and the hyssop and scarlet. The application of the blood is important. The idea of sprinkling it 7 times, that idea of fullness or completion. And so it speaks to the complete cleansing of that household, and that it is now free to be inhabited once again, and it's no longer affected by the leprosy that had been such a problem to it. Like I said a moment ago, there were no further sacrifices, so there weren't the lamb, the burnt offering and sin offering and trespass offering like there was for the individual, just this to cleanse the household itself. The chapter concludes with kind of a summary of the various laws that we've covered dealing with leprosy, verses 54 through 57. This is the law for all manner of plague of leprosy and scald, and for the leprosy of the garment and of the house, and for a rising and for a scab and for a bright spot, to teach when it is unclean and when it is clean. This is the law of leprosy. And so that's kind of summarizes it for us and reminds us of all that we've covered the last several weeks. And it seemed like a whole lot to just summarize in a few quick verses, but that's what it's been about. And hopefully now we all understand how to deal with leprosy, right? Or at least hopefully we're reminded of the dreadfulness of sin and the need for atonement of sin. Because ultimately that's kind of the picture that's being painted more so than it is about for our social health and all that kind of stuff. So next week we'll move on to chapter 15, which addresses what's described as running issues. I'll just tell you now, this is going to be a very broad and generalized look at this, because if you get into the details, we don't want to get into the details of a lot of it. And so just so you know, that'll be the case. Again, like it was with leprosy, we're not going into medical detail of all this. That's not the point that's being made. So we'll just try to focus on the point that's there and not the details. So any questions or comments?